I would like to introduce Stavros Lambrinidis, the U.S. ambassador from the EU, and here he is. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Nice to meet you. Here you go.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, you're welcome.
And, you know, what a fantastic place, let me just say.
Thank you.
And I've only been here for 2.5 months, but now I have a fantastic place to bring the family. So thank you very much.
You're
Thanks.
very welcome.
So, guys, excuse the tie, but I just had a couple of meetings with other people in town, and I ran through. So, good evening. It's fantastic to be here in the Red Bear. We never get crowds like this one when we have official panels. So I am really proud that we decided to have the meeting here so we can actually have a real conversation with, may I say, real people who don't walk around dressed like this all the time, on a hugely important topic, which is fighting discrimination against the LGBTI community, and more importantly, creating a positive, wonderful, strong atmosphere for inclusion for everyone. The European Union and myself personally marched on Saturday at Capitol Pride. This was just one. This was just one of the many events. This is the second one that we're doing to celebrate LGBTI rights this month around the city, and frankly around the world. So let me start. Now I have to read. Thanking the team of Red Bear for hosting us. Simon B., Brian van den Euwe, and Cameron Raspet. Are you here? Can you raise your hands? Okay. And welcome our three panelists. Phil Crean from the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce. Where are you? There you go. Drew Keller from Open for Business. Drew. Dina Feidas from Out and Equal. She spoke to me in Greek when I came. Her father is Greek. I never thought, but there it is. And Bob Wittek, a member of the Human Rights Campaign Business Council. Hi, Bob. Thanks to all for giving us a chance. Now, dear friends, very quickly. I wasn't born an ambassador in the United States. I'm a politician fundamentally, and my job the past 6 years in the European Union was to do the European Union's human rights foreign policy. So I've traveled a lot around the world, promoting human rights, and the rights of the LGBTI community have been in the front and center of my attention. Fighting discrimination, fighting violence, fighting persecution on the basis of sexual orientation and sexual identity. Now, you know how it is. Maybe you don't know much around the world, but I can tell you, many people use cultural arguments, traditional values arguments, religious values arguments to continue to prosecute, discriminate, bully. And very often this ends up into hate crimes, into extreme forms of violence, into torture sometimes, into murder. I've been there and I've seen it. I was in Honduras, one of the most famous, most inspiring LGBTI activists that I had ever met in my life was murdered. And I stopped all my official visits, everything, with the foreign minister, with the Minister of Justice, in order to visit the LGBTI officers community in Honduras and to meet with everyone to express my condolences and the European Union's condolences. I wanted to send a message that it is not okay. It is not okay to discriminate and certainly not to kill people just because you happen not to like them. And I'm happy to say that the press was there and covered that visit. They did not silence it. But the picture around the world is not good. 72 countries, not one, not two, 72 today, discriminate, have in fact, criminalize same-sex relations. That is not okay. And countries who don't, in many instances, have laws that are very weak and very easily violated. Or they have police or judges that are not trained at all to arrest people for violating those laws that, in theory, do not allow violence or discrimination against the LGBTI people. So, as far as our policy is concerned, a lot of our work, and my work, focus on training, educating, funding even, services in different countries to ensure that protection is not just on the books where it exists, but in practice. And where LGBTI rights are criminalized, to change those laws. We have human rights guidelines in the European Union. That is instructions to every one of 150 ambassadors around the world, including me now, on how to fight discrimination against LGBTI people. And we have 45 those with instructions, guidelines again, on non-discrimination more broadly that just came out in March. We are donors worldwide to civil society, among the top donors in the world. And we work with civil society and activists all over. Because in the end of the day, it is they on the ground that suffer the discrimination, but also can inspire the inspiration, also can build the bridges, also fight every day to change their lives, whereas we visit for a day and leave the next. And it is my commitment, and the European Union's commitment, that these are our heroes. These are our heroes. Now, I'm not going to get a big part of this speech on what we do in the European Union, but I want to tell you that we put our money where our mouth is. We don't just preach outside. Our own conventions, our own laws contain an obligation not to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, and we apply it. And let me just tell you that relatively recently, the Audiovisual Services Media Directive of the European Union was amended to ensure that hate speech and incitement to violence and discrimination is illegal in media, including major online platforms. We will not allow for hatred to spread and incitement to violence to spread against the LGBTI community. That is over. Now, this is an event on business and LGBTI rights. And let me just say simply here that not only does EU law prohibit discrimination in the workplace on the basis of sexual orientation, but also we're working with everyone, including companies and big businesses, to ensure that it costs them if they work in countries and invest in countries where such discrimination, let alone criminalization, exists. We have a law in the European Union that obligates our biggest companies to report back to us every year in their annual reports, not just financial information, how much money they made for their shareholders, but also any violation of human rights that they have been forced to do where they practice their business. And I urge civil society, including the United States, to take those public reports and to examine them, and to make sure they're not just a ticking the box exercise, but a real way to pressure business around the world. And let me say, maybe some business does not need to be pressured. There are already major corporations that are putting in their own internal guidelines the obligation not to discriminate, even if a foreign government asks them to. Now, let me close by saying this, dear friends. I have been to over 50, 60 countries around the world on human rights the past few years. And we are conducting about 50 human rights dialogues with 50 different countries every year. In many of those dialogues and visits, LGBTI rights is on the top of my agenda, has been and continues to be. And when I go to particularly difficult places where rights are repressed, I often get a similar thing. Mr. Lambrinidis. By the way, let me just thank you for pronouncing my name brilliantly without reading it. That doesn't happen often. Mr. Lambrinidis, why are you poisoning our relationship by raising all those gay and lesbian things with us? Look at the public opinion polls in our country. The vast majority of our people don't like gays and lesbians. Why are you bringing it up? Let's talk about other things. Interesting, isn't it? They actually believe it, many of them. They strongly believe that that is an okay argument to raise. And I say many things, but I say two things mostly to that. The first thing I say is, you know what? LGBTI people and LGBTI activists, they're not demanding special rights. They don't deserve special rights. But they deserve exactly the same rights that every other citizen in your country has. If you cannot kick me, and if you cannot beat me up, if you cannot imprison me, if you cannot fire me, if you cannot insult me because I'm Greek, or because I'm black or white, you cannot do it because I'm gay. You can't. We are human beings, we're not animals. We all have the same human dignity. The same human dignity. And the second thing I tell them is, you know what? We are all minorities. At some point in our lives or another, we are all minorities. Maybe in this room, someone is in the majority because of their gender. But at the same time that they're in the majority because of their gender, they are, I guarantee you, a minority because of another reason. Maybe because of their religion. Maybe because of their disability. Maybe because of their sexual orientation. Maybe because of the color of their skin. The moment you think that when you're in a majority, you can discriminate against those people who are unpopular, whom you don't like, you're opening the door to hell. Because you're opening the door to your own discrimination at some point. It is not okay. It is not okay. Now, we don't like gays, Mr. Lambrinidis. We still don't like them. You know what? Nelson Mandela, maybe everyone has a favorite quote from Nelson Mandela, but I've been very inspired by this one. He said, if you can be taught how to hate, you can be taught how to love. In fact, the natural state of human beings are to love, not to hate. You get two babies together, maybe, one black, one white. Their instinct is to just look at each other, touch each other. It's curiosity. They don't hate each other. If they end up hating each other, someone taught them how to hate. If you can learn how to hate, you can learn how to love. And I promise you that everyone in the European Union delegation in this great country and around the world are out in a campaign to make sure that we can try to teach people how to love. And if this event here can contribute a little bit to that, I will be a very proud person. Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. It's going to be difficult to follow up such a great speech. But if I can invite the speakers to join me here in the panel, please.
I'll grab that park over here.
Thank you again, Ambassador, and thank you everyone for joining us today to discuss this very important topic. I have here with me a fantastic panel of experts on business and inclusion. Drew, I'm going to start with Bob here. Bob Wittek, President and Founder of Wittek Communication. Drew Keller, Global Program Director at Open for Business. Phil Graham, Director of the Global Program at the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce. And Dina Fidas, Managing Director of Global Stakeholders Engagement and Out and Equal. Welcome again for joining us, and thank you very much. Drew, let me start with you. Can you tell us a bit more about the work that you do at Open for Business and the case for business inclusion? To put it bluntly, why should companies care about inclusion, about LGBT rights?
Yeah, definitely. And before I do that, I just want to thank you for having all of us. We all speak on a lot of panels, oftentimes together. But I have to say, this is probably the coolest venue that we've been to. And those handkerchiefs are something else, so that's pretty cool. So I'm Global Program Director for Open for Business. Open for Business is a coalition of 27 big global companies that have been leading on LGBT inclusion, over the past number of years. Companies like Google, IBM, GSK, and a number of others. Our purpose is to use the influence of those companies in the private sector writ large to advance LGBT rights, specifically in challenging environments. So we don't do any work in the United States or Western Europe. We do most of our work in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, etc. Now, the second part of the question was, why should companies care about this? Yeah. So we lead everything that we do with research. So we're sort of half of a think tank. We do a lot of research into the economic and business case for LGBT rights because as we are a coalition of companies, the way that they talk about this issue is through the data that shows that open and inclusive environments are good for business and they're actually essential for economic growth. So we do a lot of work into building out that case, adding data to the already robust argument, putting it into new contexts, looking at different countries, etc. The way that we talk about it at the highest level is in three major categories. So we say in open and inclusive environments, economic performance improves, so economies perform better. Business performance improves, so companies themselves perform better. And individual performance improves, so people themselves perform better. And there are, we have 27 individual, what we call propositions, but essentially just reasons that back up those three overall categories. Things like LGBT-friendly countries tend to attract more foreign direct investment. They're better able at connecting to global markets. They have lower levels of brain drain, higher levels of entrepreneurship, and a lot of other things. Companies that are LGBT inclusive, they are better able at attracting and retaining talent. There's a bunch of studies that show that. They're more innovative, collaborative. There's a lot of really interesting top-line indicators that show that the most LGBT-inclusive companies perform better financially, things like share price, return on equity, free cash flow. So those driving indicators for investors and for shareholders are improving as well. And on the individual level, as I'm sure is not surprising to many of us, whenever you're operating in a place where you can be yourself, you tend to be more productive. People are healthier. They're more collaborative. They go the extra mile. And there's a bunch of other reasons like that. So that's sort of the entire case. And we always lead with that because it's a business's language, essentially.
I think you've put it very well. I think the case for inclusion, the numbers tell it all. Like, LGBT inclusive companies, they are able to be more innovative, they are able to better retain employees, and it also makes better marketing for customers. So inclusion, however, does not happen overnight, and companies need to walk that journey into being inclusive. So Bob, you were the first actually certified LGBT-friendly business in the US, if I said that correctly. And now you work on advising companies on how to get there. So what are your recommendations? What do you tell them and how do you convince them that this is the way to go?
Well, let me start out by thanking the ambassador to begin with for setting the stage. Very inspiring, very passionate. And when I see that flag now, I know those values travel with you. So thank you for that. I would also say, too, I think we have a large crowd here, Paula, because I think you told this audience it was gay karaoke night.
Yes. And free beer.
And it's not. So,
I can sing.
yeah. All right, we'll do that. We'll break into song in a minute. I want to back up, though. I became the first certified LGBT-owned business in America in 2004. But that was after 10 years of working with major corporations. Because in 1993, we began working with American Airlines. And you trust me, at that time, in 1993, it was all risk and very little reward. They had to step out, put their neck out, put their feet out, and talk out loud about issues that scared executives. And one anecdote I'll just start with and give it to you how it happened. The first meeting we had with their top executives, one of them asked me, "Do you think we have many gay people at American Airlines?" And yeah, I know, I nearly went down that road too. I stifled the giggle. And I began to realize, though, what Drew and certainly Phil and Dina work on today is creating the economic basis for this work. It's one thing to go instinctively that doing the right thing. When you're dealing with business decision makers, they've got to be modeled on numbers and on reality. So in '93, when you didn't know how many gay people worked anywhere, you had to begin by asking the right questions and creating the economic case, which is what we all do today.
Thank you. Dina, you also have done a lot of work on equality in the workplace from the non-profit perspective. Can you tell us a bit more how non-profits can actually advise business and work with them to help them achieve equality?
Absolutely.
And why it's important also that activists and non-profit work together for this?
Thank you. And Efaristo, that means thank you to Ambassador Lambrinidis and to our hosts. It was personally moving to me to hear your words. So, Efaristo, Axios, worthy. So my name is Constantina Fidas. I was at the Human Rights Campaign for almost 12 years, and now I'm at Out and Equal. And thank you. I consider myself very fortunate to be able to do this work. I like to think that, the Greeks invented homosexuality and we activists can perfect it. So, but the question is about how can civil society or nonprofits become partners to business? And many of us who get to do this work now, we are indebted to some of the early leaders like Bob Wittick, who was an original business strategist, and Elizabeth Birch and so many others who realized there is an incentive for businesses to become inclusive. Who here has heard of Alan Turing? Alan Turing is the computer scientist who's credited with helping to bring World War II to a close. And yet he was driven to suicide. He was essentially tortured for being gay. And imagine what the history books would be like if he was able to be himself in the world. That's a rather stark example, but those of us in the civil society and the nonprofit community, we get to work with private businesses. We get to elevate our stories. In many times, I have been fortunate enough to walk into Southern businesses in which the individual I've been connected with believes that they're the only LGBT person in the room. And I get to walk in with the full weight and legacy of a prominent LGBT organization. And so I think those of us in the civil society world are walking in without a political agenda. We are working in service of both LGBT and allied employees. And also we have a unique perspective on how inclusion can benefit businesses. So in many ways, I think what the LGBT, nonprofit, and civil society community has done is establish a blueprint for other movements to repeat. You're now seeing the disability community, the reproductive health and women's health community very much take a lead from our playbook and see gains along the way.
I think that's That's very right, actually, how you lead with the example. But if I can zoom out a bit and go to the global sphere, as the ambassador have said, there are 72 countries in the world that have very harsh discriminative laws against LGBTI people. And I know that you do a lot of work with the Chamber of Commerce in countries with discrimination is widespread and is like a day-to-day thing. So how do you work on these countries and how do you explain business there the advantages of joining the club, if I may say so?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll first say I love being asked the last question because I get to soak up all of the...
It's not the last.
Well, in the lineup.
I have more.
Yes, and we're ready. Because I get to soak up all of the expertise of the folks to my left and my right. And in many ways, they tee up what we're really talking about, which is how to effectively engage the private sector. So we're looking forward to those questions. I work for the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce in the United States. Thanks. That's NGLCC for short, and we are essentially the business voice of the LGBT community, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. What does that mean? Essentially, we first and foremost look out on behalf of LGBT business owners, and this is really important because I would say a lot of advocacy in the United States tends to miss out on this demographic. It focuses on LGBT people as individuals or the LGBT community as this large group. What's missing is this in-between demographic. It's the business owner. And there's many of us, and we do a lot of different diverse things, and it's incredible to bring them together and to share in and celebrate the collective power and strength that we have, that Dina, you were talking about. Because we are resilient and we contribute significantly to our societies and to our economies, right? And so it's really through that strength-based approach that we excel in. And I think when we talked about LGBT issues, focus in the United States or even every other country, we all have to acknowledge the dual side of this, which is there are significant challenges and human rights concerns which speak to violence and discrimination and stigma and social exclusion. And that's important. We always need to address that and learn more about that. And then the flip side is true. When we are in a culture of inclusion, when there are laws to support our well-being, we contribute significantly to our economies and to the private sector. And that's a wonderful thing to acknowledge, that flip side. So that's what we do in the US a little bit. I would say internationally, and this is kind of getting to a little bit of your question, we have a global division, which is essentially a network now of 15 LGBTI chambers of commerce. And here I say lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex. It's really important to say LGBTI, particularly when we're hosted by the European Union, because they are very inclusive of the rights of intersex people, which is incredible. We can look to February of this past year at a resolution on behalf of intersex groups that we should always celebrate. So internationally, the NGLCC Global Network is this network of 15 chambers that do various things around the world. We really, of course, we acknowledge the challenges that our communities face, but we also work to empower them and connect them to the private sector. So we can look at this work with the private sector in two ways. The first is to acknowledge that policies can be created in order to require businesses to be much more inclusive. We see this throughout Europe, we see this in the United States, we see this in other countries, particularly in the developing world, as they get these policies to require corporations to do it. And then the other side is true too, and this is what Dina hit upon, is the incentives. What is the incentives for them to work with diverse organizations, diverse communities? And there, it's a question of understanding mutually beneficial relationships and entry points. So in the United States, in Europe, in a number of countries, there's corporate social responsibility, there's diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and of course there's supplier diversity, which is a way that what Bob was hitting upon, why a corporation would want to work with a diverse-owned supplier throughout its supply chain, because it's good for the supplier, it's good for the diverse community, and it's good for the corporation in the long term. So to get to your question, we do work in countries where same-sex acts are criminalized. We work in countries where there is significant stigma, and we work in countries where stigma is significantly decreased. So it's a very diverse group of partners, and what we really find, what truly galvanizes the support of the private sector is creating those mutually beneficial relationships that is a win-win.
But how do you convince them to join? I mean, what do you tell them? What is their, why would they gain something to be inclusive in countries with inclusiveness is not a positive value? And this is a question for you, but also for Drew, because I also know that you do that kind of question. What do you tell these businesses?
Yeah, maybe I'll start out because Drew, you touched on having the data, right? And that's so important that we need so much data, right? I would say that there's a fair amount of qualitative data out there that LGBTI organizations have gathered, right? But we really need quantitative data, and there are more international organizations doing this. There's a Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU. There's the World Bank that's really gathering these quantitative data sets to showcase the challenges. What Open for Business is really great at is looking at the data that already exists and saying this is why it's beneficial. So having more data like that shows why the benefit of interacting with LGBTI groups should be the starting point, and we just need so much more of it. We exist in too much of a data vacuum as it is, but Open for Business has done a great job at looking at that, and maybe you can go into that. But in terms of really convincing them, what we find throughout the NGLCC Global Network is first and foremost having a solid group of LGBTI business owners and showcasing their strength, right? And saying that this is not an act of charity. This is not something that you have to do, but this is something that you should do. The more that you integrate this into your business operations, the more benefit that you'll see. Again, whether it's to your supply chain, whether it's to your bottom line profits, or whether it's to your visibility and being seen as a leader in this space, truly showcasing the integration into business operations and the likely benefit that it'll bring is so important. And here is where we can learn from other social groups who have done this exact same thing, like women-owned businesses or ethnic minority-owned businesses or businesses owned by people with disabilities.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of the work that you all do one way or another is benchmarking, that is establishing measures to be able to measure business and their performance on your scale of LGBT equality. And a great tool for that is the Corporate Equality Index. And I have here actually the person who started the index and worked on the prototype, and Dina, who also worked on that for a long time. So could you tell me a bit more how the Corporate Equality Index works, and how do you convince businesses to be scrutinized by that? Because at the end of the day, you are auditing them and shaming them in a way.
Well, in 1996, actually, I had the opportunity to work closely with the HRC Foundation, and we did the first prototype of the Corporate Equality Index. It was rather primitive and rather simple, but then companies, again, were simple in their response. Because we tried to focus on the top 100 employers in the Washington market. And we went out to them. We couldn't do it by email. We did it by calling them and asking them if they had policies of non-discrimination and benefits. And I have to tell you, the journey was not easy. The Washington Post reported the story. Kara Swisher, of all people, wrote the story. And the thing that we learned at that moment was how reticent corporations were to talk about these questions. We ended up going from PR people to HR people to lawyers, always worried they were taking risks by saying that they did or didn't discriminate against gay people. And so we got a really great snapshot of attitudes of corporations, because when they had never been asked these questions, they just didn't know what the implications of that were. Now, fast forward to 2002, the Human Rights Campaign began to make it a little more sophisticated, clearly, and model an approach that said, let's benchmark American business employers and find out objectively what they do to embrace and include their employees. And that was great, because what began as a frontier then became a standard, a gold standard. And interestingly, even today, there's no charge to a corporation for taking it, which matters because there's so many of these surveys, and many of them are for profit, and many of them charge a company for taking their survey. And companies tell me over and over again, we've dropped out of 20 surveys, but we'll always do this one because it's the only one we know that we really have confidence in.
I would also just add, for those of you who have done work globally or to dovetail on what the ambassador said, there are dozens of countries that criminalize LGBT relationships. The United States was one of them until 2003. And if you heard Bob, the first corporate equality index was 2002, the year before. And so in 2002, when a growing LGBT national organization, the Human Rights Campaign, went to the corporate community, guess what? In the United States, you could be thrown in jail for having sex with your partner as a gay man. You could not join the military. The Defense of Marriage Act was law of the land. Despite the fact that Judy and Dennis Shepard were visiting lawmaker by lawmaker by lawmaker, our community did not even have basic hate crimes protections. So you want to talk about a very grim legal and legislative environment, the United States was it. We still today lack federal civil rights protections. And so what is phenomenal is that in 2002, we collectively were able to convince the business community not to avoid lawsuits because they didn't have to fear that, not to avoid a bad reputation because that wasn't yet in the air, but we convinced them of the value of our community, to their ingenuity and to their long-term growth. And in 2002, at the same time, Phil's organization, NGLCC, was getting off the ground. And that was yet another flashpoint, to say our community has value. We don't just deserve a seat at the table. When we're at the table, your companies are more profitable. And that was a transformative moment in our civil rights movement.
Thank you. And the Corporate Equality Index, if I'm not mistaken, rate companies by their performance on LGBTI-friendly policies inside. But according to the UN Conduct for Businesses, they also have an obligation to care about the right and inclusion of the communities where they are working. So my question for you would be, for all of you, what role can businesses play in countries where discrimination is a reality? How can businesses help advancing? Not government necessarily taking the lead, but businesses, because in many ways they are more advanced in inclusion.
I'm thinking of Drew's outfit.
Yeah, okay, I can start with that, and then we can go. So just to give more background on the UN Standards of Conduct that Paula mentioned, they are 5 standards that the UN Free and Equal campaign put out about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, that essentially are guidelines for how companies should act on LGBT inclusion everywhere that they operate around the world. So they range from things like respect human rights in the workplace, actively support your LGBT employees, and then the 5th one, which is the most difficult by far, is that companies should act in the public sphere. So in the communities that they're operating in, they should take an active stance to advance LGBT rights and inclusion in those societies outside of their 4 walls. This scares the hell out of a lot of companies that are operating in really challenging places. And sort of what we heard at Open for Business as our coalition partners were signing up was if they had really no idea how to implement that 5th standard in a lot of the most challenging places that they're working. So think like Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, places where gay sex is criminalized. And so we went about and we actually worked with the UN to put together a framework to sort of broaden out the world of opportunity that companies have whenever they think about what it's like to act in the public sphere. So if you ask a company what they think acting in the public sphere means, they think it is, or they go immediately to like signing on to public statements, which is immensely helpful. Having conversations with government officials behind closed doors, which is also immensely helpful. But sometimes those are just non-starters in a lot of countries that they're operating in. And so we built out a framework that essentially has 5 different channels of influence for how companies can take action in these challenging places. So it's things like working throughout the value chain, so throughout your supply chain to make sure suppliers are not discriminating. Stuff like what Phil does at NGLCC, but even broader than that, even non-LGBT businesses that are in your supply chain, make sure that they aren't discriminating. Things like working with institutional investors at a global level to make sure that LGBT rights and inclusion is baked into their ESG, their environmental, social governance standards. Things like engaging with civil society directly, providing them space to meet, providing them expertise, providing them with a bunch of other things, engaging with media, and getting national chambers of commerce on board and other industry groups that carry a lot of weight. So there's really a lot that companies can do. And I think what we hope to show with that is that there is no reason a company should not be taking an action in the public sphere in any place that they're operating. So there's really a lot that can happen.
The one thing that companies are doing more is they're acting in coalition.
Yeah.
None of them need feel they're alone anymore. And so there is that power of that. If you're at Davos any year, their organizations are also there. And they have a seat at the table with CEOs. I don't want to give you one little example. Last 2 years, Bermuda, a client of mine out of Bermuda succeeded in enacting marriage equality in its Supreme Court. But the government shut it down once, twice, 3 times. But they litigated and won once, twice, 3 times. And they only did it because Carnival Corporation paid their legal bills. So companies can stand in there side by as civil leaders and say, your cause is my cause. And let's make common cause to make marriage equality possible.
I'm actually glad you mentioned Davos and the World Economic Forum, because I was chatting with Dina earlier, and I was very surprised to hear that inclusion is a topic that is seriously discussed there. So, Dina, would you maybe tell us, and also some of you might add, what are the global 10 trends on business and equality? What are these discussions look like, and who is taking the lead?
Thank you. Yeah, I would say, some of the most globally influential businesses are LGBT plus inclusive. I got to be at Davos this last January. This year was the 5th year that LGBTI issues actually had real estate at Davos, and this was the first year that LGBT issues were on what's called the main stage. I think it's arguable how much that impacts the daily lives of LGBT individuals, but nonetheless, in my work, when I've worked with the oil giant in Mexico, Pemex, or with reluctant businesses around the world, the moment you show them the news clips of Davos, people sit up in their chairs. It's not just symbolic, it actually can propel material change forward, because it says to people that some of the most powerful and the key influencers in our global economy are not just paying attention to this, they care about this and they're prioritizing this. And I think when you look at the businesses that partner with all of us, whether as clients, as supplier diversity partners, these are many of the businesses moving this ball forward. Accenture, Omnicom, MasterCard, Deutsche Bank. These are the businesses that are telling structures of power, such as the World Economic Forum, that LGBT plus issues are the wave of the future.
Before I open it to the floor and to the public for questions, you all work for inclusion. So if you could, one of you, tell me one recommendation either for businesses or governments to implement to achieve equality, what would that be? One wish.
Well, I would say invite and listen to the quietest person in the room. And that person may not be LGBT, it may be an ally, it may be a mother who's scared to talk about their gay child. But force yourself to listen to the person who is currently the quietest person in the room and give them a platform to speak up and to lead.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I can't put it into one. I have 3, and
Okay.
it's only because it's not every day that you get, the ear of an ambassador to the EU. So just to hit 3 recommendations specifically for governments and for the EU, I would say first and foremost that governments have a role and a responsibility to create the policy incentives, but also the regulations to keep the private sector corporations in check. I think we've been talking about the benefits of when corporations engage LGBTI groups, but also it should be done in a way that we also have to remember that they're major purveyors of wealth and corruption, and there needs to be a good policy framework for some of the corporations out there. It's not a magic bullet to engage a corporation. Policies have to be there to regulate and create those policy incentives. The second, I think, would be because this is the European Union, we have to, I think going back to the ambassador's point, you said you put your money where your mouth is, and that's incredible. And that's part of why I'm here, is because in fact, the EU does support LGBTI groups, not only in member countries, but in potential accession countries. And my recommendation there is to continue that and to see it as very viable to the social fabric, social cohesion, and economies. I think looking at the EU's work, actually the international community's work, the EU, the World Bank, with the Roma population, that is a really good example that we could follow from in terms of LGBTI issues, from the data, from national policy plans, and from expected markers of inclusion through their governments. I think Roma sets a really good standard that we could follow. And then the third is, I think we should really take seriously this growing and staunchly conservative ultra-right movement in a lot of European Union countries, and in this one right here. Let's not forget that we're in a bubble in DC. This is, frankly, I don't want to be melodramatic, but very frightening, and I think a threat to the multilateral system. And I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of reasons why, whether it's migration, whether it's, as the ambassador said, how they use traditional values, not only to push away LGBTI issues, but also to push away gender equality goals. It's all really connected, and we can see that how it's connected. And I think as governments and also as civil society, we really need to do a better job at understanding these ultra-right movements and how they've effectively become major political parties in a lot of our countries. And again, we can find solidarity amongst our social groups, but also I think at the governmental level, we have to remember that the European Union and the multilateral system is not infallible, is not there forever, and I think we just need to remember that as we push a more inclusive social and economic ecosystem.
Cool. Is this still on? Yeah. I have two really short ones. The first for business is quite simple. Make sure that somebody in the C-suite has direct ownership over your LGBT inclusion agenda, and don't silo it to human resources or diversity and inclusion, because that's what the most successful companies do. The second would be for governments, and it's quite simple, and something that Phil and I were talking about last Friday. But for embassies that are existing in these challenging countries, actively support the civil society groups on the ground and just simply provide them space to meet, because that's like one of the scarcest resources that they have sometimes.
I would just mention the power of leadership to set the mood, to set the tone, to set the direction. If you cannot clone our ambassador, which we should try to do, clone you everywhere, I'll give you two stories that spoke loudest to me. 25 years ago, imagine, we were celebrating the 25th anniversary of Stonewall, and a vice chairman of American Airlines decided they had to connect with all of their customers and their workforce to make sure that when they arrived in New York 25 years ago, that they would feel welcome. And we helped him write his script, and he did this message that went to everybody in their workforce. It was so powerful that it even ran across the screen in Times Square and caused some American Airlines employees to cry because they couldn't imagine the voice of their leaders saying this. Now fast forward to today, I get to work with Marriott and the CEO, Arne Sorensen, who unbeknownst to me, did a graduation speech last year at a Lutheran college he had attended, and he brought his message there. So it's taking our message everywhere to places of faith and business and schools and society generally, so that we're not just talking to ourselves. We're really engaging and inspiring everyone through the voice of people who connect. And we need that.
Thank you. And now I would like to open the floor for questions. So please identify yourself before speaking.
Hi. I'm so lost. Hi, my name is Cornelius Joy. I represent the Capital Area Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. And so one of the questions I want to ask the panel, I do a lot of work with NGLCC, but one of the questions I want to ask the panel is that how do we continue the voice for the generation behind us and making sure that they have the voice that we have, the voice that we've done, and people who have paved the way before us. So my question is, how do we encourage the next generation, the generation that's the 20s and the 18-year-olds, to continue to do the work? How do we inspire them to continue to do the work? Like, we do the work continually, day to day, day out, but how do we keep inspiring the next generation to continue to do the work that's been done and that's going to continue to be done?
I'd say I'm a member of the chamber. Thank you for being here. My hope is, too, that we will hire these young people who have big hearts and big aspirations. And a year ago, when one of my colleagues today graduated from college, he transitioned and now is becoming a young leader in the trans movement. And I think what I find from that experience, I could say personally, I learn. And I think that, to Dina's point, I feel that obligation my generation has to listen and learn, because the language is changing, the ideas are changing, the needs are changing, definitions are changing. And so those of us who went before have got to slow down and make room for young leadership to come in. And so I hope all of us hire those kinds of people and we really mentor them.
I would also say, I would just say that none of us can fall into the trap of inevitability. A lot of us talk about this generation doesn't care, they're post-gay, they're post-labels. No civil rights movement has been won by sitting around saying, well, it's just inevitable, the next generation's got it. This is a generation that turned on their TVs a few years ago and saw the Pulse shooting. This is a generation that's seeing their peers killed primarily because they're transgender women of color in this country. And I don't think we can forget the full spectrum of experiences. It is true that attitudes are changing and identities are evolving. And I think it's up to us to fight as urgently today as we will in 5 and 10 years, and to also be okay giving up more of our seats. That the panel next time will include more, 21, 23, 24-year-olds to tell their stories.
I think we are all quite young here, no? I feel, at least. Some more questions. Go.
All right, this is working great. My name is Tushar Malik, and I'm an LGBT rights activist. I actually started at the grassroots in India, and I've been living in the United States for a while, and I literally just got back from Europe 3 days ago. So taking it away from the United States and going towards Europe and going towards other continents, and I wanted to understand what all of your perspective, like, what's your thought on leadership that is non-American? So either global South leadership in LGBT rights advocacy as well as at the workplace, and also European leadership. Just what has your sense been? Has there been a shift in terms of who's taking ownership of their own journeys? Or do you think it's still very US-centric as the United States is kind of pushing this idea of like what it means? Do you think it's really been, like, is it becoming homegrown finally?
I can go first. So it is still, so I'll say it's still sort of Western driven, US, UK, like Western Europe driven, but it's starting to shift slowly, especially among big companies. So over the last, I want to say 4 years, we've been tracking of the 100 fastest growing multinational firms that are headquartered in the Global South. We've been tracking which of them have explicit non-discrimination policies for sexual orientation, gender identity. I think it started in 2014 with like 19 of them did then in 2016 it was 30 maybe, and now it's 40. So it is like those companies are starting to factor that into their operations. There's been a big boom in India of companies coming to the table for it. But the conversation is still mostly driven by sort of Western multinationals, but it's changing. Small and medium enterprises, though, on the other side, are different. So you'll see a lot of small and medium enterprises in the Global South who are like, from the get-go, just ingraining all sorts of diversity and inclusion into their core operations. And so they're not even thinking about it as like a tack-on that they put onto their core business. They're really just starting to think about it from the start.
If I can also take my hat as moderator as a while, because I work for the European Union here, and I think the European Union is a great leader on LGBTI rights at the global sphere. And it's a Western movement, as you said, but there are also some countries, like, for example, Argentina, that has taken the lead of LGBTI rights, or Chile. So it's not anymore pocketed in what you would call the Western world, but more and more countries are joining the movement. And in Europe, for example, the most inclusive country, anyone has a guess? Malta. Is the most inclusive country in Europe, more than Sweden, more than Norway, more than any other country that you want. So I think that there are some things that are not so obvious, but if you look behind, you will see them.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
and sorry. Shout out to Malta also for having like one of the best laws protecting intersex people all over, setting a really clear example. I tend to try to bring up intersex as much as possible because sometimes we say LGBTI so quickly that we forget that very important group. But Tushar, I think back to your question. My team just got back from India 2 weeks ago, where we worked with partners, of course, in Delhi to launch India's first LGBTI diverse chamber of commerce, right? And our global network, I didn't say where we operate, but it's now in India, South Africa, throughout Europe, throughout Latin America, and many in South America and the Caribbean, right? So I would agree with Drew in a sense that a lot of this could be Western-led, in the sense that a lot of the policies and entry points that were created in headquarters tend to be in the US or in parts of Europe, right? So in that sense, when these corporations are going global with the entry points that were created, it is led in that way. But what we've seen through a lot of our chambers with a lot of our partners is the innovative programming that they're creating, is the various ways that they're actively bringing together LGBTI people and working with corporations in their context to hire them directly. And not only just general population LGBTI people, but also LGBTI inmates, right? Like people who are formerly in prison. Like this is a group that never gets visibility ever, right? But some of our chambers are figuring out ways to work with formerly incarcerated LGBTI people and directly train them and then get them into the formal sector, into good paying jobs. And that's distinctly not something that was created in the US, that was created elsewhere. And in that sense, when we are seeing so many innovative programs like that are led by non-Western, non-US, non-EU countries.
There. Megan Clohessy, formerly an intern with the German Marshall Fund. Thank you all for speaking today. I think this is a very important event. About a question back, we were talking about trying to get more LGBT young people into entrepreneurship. So my question for the whole panel is, what initiatives do exist to help drive LGBT youth, I'm thinking, teenagers, early 20s, into entrepreneurship? And if there aren't a lot of initiatives, what improvements need to be made in order to get them?
Well, one thing I've been admiring for some years are the growth of programs at the college and graduate schools. There's so many more. The Reaching Out conference for MBAs, it's highly vibrant. Most schools are very invested in that. Again, those are hard places to get into and to afford, but they're places where they're very global too. They're very international. They're very diverse, and I think those are places that corporations are increasingly funding and sponsoring because they view them as talent drivers. One thing I want to mention about India particularly, I work with Stanford's Business School. They've had for 4 years an innovative executive leadership program. It's meant for business folks. But the two biggest growth students, the path that students are coming from, are India and Brazil. And I think Brazil, it's the Bolsonaro effect. They want to go back in civil society, as we do, and push back against political repression. And the voice of business leaders are very effective. So to have the Brazilians and Indians come forward to lead these business groups is very important.
There was a question, I think, in the back.
Hello, my name's Alicia. My parent is a trans woman. And I have a question basically about economics. So do you perceive or do you find there to be any issue with perhaps, speaking on a micro scale, like municipalities co-opting the inclusivity movement for the economic gains? Do you perceive that as an issue? Are you concerned about that?
Can I respond? Because I have to deal with this every day. The businesses that I work with, we have this conversation every single day because we have to. The notion that a world doesn't exist without corporate engagement, it's where we spend most of our waking hours, many of us. It's how we make wealth and we work. But at the same time, when they rainbow their message, they have to do it with true authenticity. They have to bring with it not just the colors, they have to bring with it the policies and the leadership and the advocacy on our behalf. And so when they walk in the pride parades or they tart up things with rainbow colors, you, I, all of us ask that same question. Are they actually invested in our futures? Or are they simply spending money on a commercial message? And I think to their benefit, the way I view most of them today is they hear that. They get that. Not all of them practice it as best they should. But most of them today, if I looked at the Pride campaigns this year, many of them are investing back into our causes. They're really actively addressing, I hope, the marginalized people in our communities even more. None of us in this room probably worry about the privilege we own, but we have to address the privilege that doesn't exist in our community outside these walls. So to the extent you raise the question is to answer it, is to demand that they do.
I was also going to say that, entities can only effectively co-op a movement if we collectively, allies, LGBT, allow them to. And so we need to keep the pressure on and get informed. Bob Whittick's data over the last decade shows that the LGBT consumer market is amongst the most well-informed. We're not tricked by a simple rainbow flag. Ask them the questions. Do you have transgender protections? Are you ensuring your trans employees get healthcare coverage? Ask them their HRC Corporate Equality Index scores. So I'm less worried about the movement being co-opted because I think the strength of people in rooms like this won't allow that to effectively happen.
Actually, that question that you asked, we were discussing with them just before starting because it's something that I wanted to ask them during the discussion because when I saw Pride here walking around DC with all these hotels with their pride flags, I thought, is this real or is this not real? But I think the fact that you have such a vibrant civil society in the US, it's the balance and the checks of that movement because you are not going to allow these businesses have a rainbow flag and they're not implementing the right policies with their employees, right?
I've got to add one PS. This fall in the Supreme Court, we are facing the battle of our lives. The non-discrimination protections we've sought for decades are on the chopping block before the Supreme Court. Corporate support for that movement is critical to convincing, we hope 9 people, but also the American people, that it's an economic driver, that it's an imperative, that employers be armed with the same non-discrimination rules in every jurisdiction in the United States. So wherever they do business, they know the gay people, the lesbians, the bisexuals, transgender, the queer and questioning people have the same protections under law everywhere in the United States. If we don't have business on our side then, it's that much harder.
And perhaps one point, because Dina, I love it, ask them, hold them accountable. Yes, let's continue to do that. And I think also, I mean, because there are a number of indices out there, like the HRCs in your former work, that are benchmarking, right? But beyond that, we have to remember that if human rights is our baseline, is our normative approach to these issues, it's not just the human rights of LGBTI people, it's the human rights of all groups. And I think there are a lot of good diagnostic tools out there, like human rights-based assessments, that really look at corporate supply chains and in all of the countries that they work to make sure that they're not violating their rights. Because it's not quite okay, it's not acceptable even a bit if they purport to be pro-LGBTI in Europe or the US, but then utilize sweatshop labor or do something that is inherently violating the dignity and well-being of people in other parts of the world.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all of you for joining us today. I think this was a great conversation. Thank you very much for your thoughts on this. And I hope you will enjoy the beer, which is fantastic, and the food. Thank you again and for our panelists.